My girlfriend cheated on me, and when her new man robbed her, him, then came to me, but ended up from a curb. I came home after a week-long business trip, and something felt off. Not in a dramatic, obvious way, but in that subtle, nagging way that worms into your brain and refuses to let go. It started during my video calls with Laura. At first, I thought I was just overanalyzing things because I was exhausted from work, but the little details began stacking up. The living room looked different in the background. Nothing major, just small shifts. A different throw pillow on the couch. A new plant by the window. The bookshelf reorganized. Her texts became shorter. Her responses to my stories about work were lukewarm at best. Usually, she was my biggest supporter, celebrating every little win with me. But this time, I told her I landed a major client, a deal that would set me up for a promotion, and all she said was, "That's great, babe." No exclamation point. No follow-up question. Just that. I told myself she was busy or distracted. Maybe work had been rough for her. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But as soon as I walked through our front door, that uneasy feeling hit me even harder. Something had changed, and I needed to figure out what. 3 days before my flight home, I called Laura like I always did. It was late, and I was exhausted, but hearing her voice always made things better. She picked up after a couple of rings, and for a second, everything seemed normal. She was in our bedroom, wrapped in one of my hoodies, her hair pulled up in a messy bun. "Hey, babe," she said, smiling. I smiled back, feeling some of my stress melt away. "Hey you, how's your night?" "Good. Just watching some TV." Then, in the background, I heard it. A laugh. A deep, unmistakably masculine laugh. I felt my body tense. "Who's that?" She barely hesitated. "Oh, just the TV. Some dumb comedy." Her answer was quick. Too quick. I knew the sound of our TV. I knew how our speakers projected sound. And I sure as hell knew that wasn't coming from a screen. I didn't push it right away. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it really was just a show. But the unease didn't fade. If anything, it grew. I pulled into the driveway, exhausted but relieved to finally be home. The past week had been a blur of meetings, travel delays, and that nagging feeling in my gut that something was off. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. I grabbed my suitcase, walked up to the door, and slid my key into the lock. Or at least, I tried to. It didn't fit. I frowned and tried again, jiggling it slightly, convinced I was just tired and fumbling. But no, the key wouldn't turn. It was the same damn key I'd used 100 times before, but now, it was useless. Then my phone buzzed. A message from Laura. "I found someone better. Don't try to come in." I just stood there, staring at the screen, my heart hammering against my ribs. My mind went blank for a moment, like it couldn't process the words staring back at me. I found someone better. Not an apology. Not an explanation. Just that. I looked back at our door. The home we built together. The place I thought I'd be walking into after a long trip, greeted by my wife. Maybe a warm meal, the usual comfort of being home. But I wasn't home, because apparently, I wasn't wanted here anymore. I took a deep breath, staring at Laura's message. My first instinct was to call her, to demand an explanation, to yell, to get angry, but I didn't. Instead, I typed out 2 words. "Are you sure?" I hit send. No response. For a moment, I stood there on the porch, gripping my suitcase like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. The house, the one I had worked so hard for, the one we had made a home, was locked to me. And inside, she was probably with him. I turned around, got back in my car, and drove. I didn't even know where I was going at first, but eventually, I found a hotel and checked in. The numbness hadn't worn off yet. I wasn't sad. I wasn't angry. I was just processing. That's when I called Michael. "Dude, you good?" His voice was sharp with concern. "No," I admitted. Laura changed the locks. Sent me a text saying she found someone better. Silence. Then, "What the fuck?" "Yeah," I sighed. "I need you to do something for me." Michael had always been the guy who knew things. He had connections, an almost eerie ability to dig up information. And I needed answers. Less than an hour later, my phone rang. "Her new guy's name is Ethan," Michael said, his voice tight with barely contained rage. "One of her clients. He's got a reputation. Big talker. Charms his way into women's lives, then uses them to climb the ladder. I know of at least 2 other women he's done this to." I ran a hand down my face, exhaling slowly. "So this wasn't an accident," I muttered. "She knew exactly what she was doing." "Yeah, man. She played you." I stared at the ceiling of the hotel room, the weight of everything pressing down on me. Laura hadn't just left me. She had replaced me. And worse, she had done it with someone who saw her as nothing more than a stepping stone. Lying on the hotel bed, staring at the ceiling, I let Michael's words settle. She played you. I wasn't the type to wallow. If Laura wanted to throw away years of marriage for some opportunistic sleazebag, that was on her. But something wasn't adding up. Ethan wasn't rich. He wasn't successful. He was a leech. So how was Laura suddenly in a position to replace locks, buy new decor, and, based on what I saw in our last video calls, revamp the entire damn living room? I sat up, grabbed my laptop, and logged into our joint financial accounts. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. Our checking and savings accounts were intact, no sudden withdrawals, no red flags. But then I dug deeper. Hidden under a business expense account tied to her company, I found everything. A $57,000 charge for a new car, a luxury SUV. Thousands spent at high-end furniture stores. Lavish hotel stays, expensive dinners, boutique clothing. All of it paid through her business account. The problem? I still had access. When we got married, Laura asked me to help manage her finances. She was great at making money, but terrible at tracking it. So, I set up everything. Her payroll, her expenses, her business deductions. Even though she'd slowly cut me out of our personal finances over the last few months, she had forgotten one thing. I was still a registered financial advisor on her business accounts. And that meant I still had control. I sat back in the stiff hotel chair, phone in hand, my mind racing but my hands steady. Every part of me wanted to lash out, to unleash the fury that had been boiling beneath the surface since I found out the woman I had built a life with had locked me out of my own home and replaced me with a man who saw her as nothing more than a stepping stone. But I had learned a long time ago that revenge wasn't about rage. It was about control. And right now, I had all of it. So instead of blowing up her phone with accusations, I crafted a single, calculated message. By the way, those expenses you made last month, do you still have the original receipts? I hit send and waited. It didn't take long. The moment my message delivered, I saw the little typing bubble appear, then disappear, then reappear, as if she was struggling to decide what to say. Laura had never been great under pressure, and now that she realized I had caught onto something, I could practically hear her heartbeat speeding up from wherever she was. Then my phone rang. Her name flashed on the screen, and I let it go to voicemail. Not even 30 seconds later, the text started rolling in. What do you mean? Why are you asking about that? Adam, let's talk. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen, feeling a slow, satisfied calm settle over me. She was panicking. She knew what I knew. And she also knew she had royally screwed herself. A few hours later, my phone rang again, but this time, it was Michael. His voice carried that familiar mix of amusement and disbelief, like he couldn't quite believe what he was about to say. You're not going to believe this. Guess who just bailed? I already knew the answer before he even said it, but I wanted to hear it out loud. Ethan? Yup. The second Laura started freaking out, he disappeared. Blocked her number, wiped his socials, ghosted her completely. Dude didn't even try to argue. Just packed up and dipped. I let out a slow breath, shaking my head as a dark, satisfied smirk pulled at the corners of my mouth. It was almost too easy. Ethan had never been in this for love. He was in it for what she could give him. Access, money, connections. The moment he realized she wasn't the perfect meal ticket he thought she was, he did what parasites always do when their host becomes useless. He found another one. Laura had thrown away everything we had built for a man who didn't even have the decency to stay. And me? I wasn't done yet. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was heartbroken. Whatever love I had for Laura had been stomped out the moment I stood outside my own front door, locked out like a stranger, but because I was thinking 3 steps ahead. Ethan was gone. Laura was unraveling. And I still had one last move to make. The next morning, I got up early, grabbed a coffee, and sat down with my laptop. I had spent years helping Laura manage her business finances, ensuring everything was accounted for, making sure her numbers always lined up. But now, I went deeper. I combed through every transaction, every document, every expense she had run through her company. It was worse than I thought. Not only had she used company funds for personal luxuries, but she had also made unauthorized wire transfers. There were payments disguised as business expenses that didn't add up. And the kicker? Email correspondences with a competitor. I knew Laura. She wasn't just funding her new life through shady business transactions. She was selling information. Whether it was intentional or just pillow talk with Ethan, it didn't matter. She had leaked company data, And in the corporate world, that was a career death sentence. So I made a few calls. I still had contacts in high places, people who would be very interested in what I had found. It didn't take long to set up a meeting with the company's board of directors. 2 days later, I sat in a sleek conference room, watching as a handful of high-ranking executives skimmed through the documents I had printed out, their expressions shifting from confusion to concern to outright anger. "This is extensive," one of them said, flipping through the evidence. "How long has this been going on?" "Months at least," I replied. "And it's not just the money. You'll find emails, some directly from her company account, communicating sensitive internal data with external parties. I don't know how deep it goes, but I figured you'd want to see for yourselves." There was a long silence. Then, the head of the board leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. "She has two options," he said finally. "She can quietly resign and walk away before this becomes public. Or we launch a full-scale investigation." I sat there, expression unreadable, but inside, I was savoring every second of it. Laura thought she had one. She thought she could replace me, betray me, lock me out of my own house, and move on without consequences. But now, she was about to lose everything. I sat in my hotel room, a glass of whiskey in one hand, my laptop open in front of me, security camera footage streaming in real time. Laura was in our house, my house, pacing back and forth in the dim light of the living room. She looked disheveled, her usually flawless hair a mess, her expensive silk blouse wrinkled. The confidence, the arrogance that had been so clear in her texts just days ago, gone. She was panicking. I watched as she moved toward the hallway, then disappeared out of frame. I already knew where she was going. The office. The safe. I took another slow sip of my drink, leaning back in my chair as I watched her step into the small room, flicking on the light with shaky hands. She went straight to the built-in safe that had been bolted into the floor since we bought the house. That safe had always been for important documents, birth certificates, property deeds, old tax records, and a little emergency cash. She knew that. But what she didn't know, I had changed the code. I watched as she dropped to her knees in front of it, punching in the numbers she had memorized years ago, the ones we set together when we first installed it. Nothing. She tried again, this time slower, like she thought she had mistyped. Still nothing. Her frustration grew. She ran a hand through her hair, took a breath, then tried a third time, her fingers shaking now. The red light flashed, the electronic lock refusing her access. I smirked, setting my drink down on the table. She was desperate. She was scrambling. She thought that whatever she had left, cash, documents, some kind of leverage asterisk, was in that safe, and now it was locked away from her. She had lost Ethan. She had lost her job. And now, she was realizing she had lost control. She slammed her fist against the safe, let out a frustrated yell, then sat back on her heels, breathing heavily. I watched in silence, letting her sit there in the wreckage of her own choices. She had gambled everything, and she had lost. As I watched Laura sit on the floor in front of the locked safe, her head in her hands, something settled deep inside me. It wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't even anger anymore. It was the quiet, undeniable truth that had been there all along. She had never been in control. She only thought she was. She had spent the last few years parading around, acting like she was the mastermind of her own success, like she had built everything from the ground up through sheer talent and determination. She loved telling people how she had turned her business into something powerful, how she had become independent, how she had finally made it. But what she never realized, what she had been too blinded by arrogance to see, was that every single win she had ever had was because of me. I had been the one who handled the finances when she started her company. I had been the one who structured her investments, moved her assets, and protected her from every financial mistake she was too naive to even recognize. I had been the one who negotiated her biggest contracts, advised her on corporate moves, ensured she always stayed just ahead of the competition. And the biggest irony? The company she thought she owned? It wasn't even hers. 5 years ago, before the business really took off, I had arranged for the corporate shares to be registered in my name. On paper, she was the face of it all, the owner, the CEO. But in the legal structure, I was the majority shareholder. She had never noticed, never even thought to check. She had always assumed that because I supported her, because I stayed in the background, because I let her believe she was the one calling the shots, that she was truly in control. But she never was. And now, sitting there in our house, broke, abandoned, locked out of her own safe, and just days away from either resigning in disgrace or facing a full-blown legal investigation, she was finally realizing it. She had never been the one holding the strings. I was. And I always had been. The fallout happened faster than I expected. Within a week, Laura was out. No job, no severance, no golden parachute to soften the landing. She had tried to negotiate, tried to spin some story about misunderstandings and misplaced trust, but the board didn't buy it. They gave her two choices: resign quietly or have every detail of her fraud exposed in a full-scale investigation that would not only destroy her career but likely get her blacklisted from ever working in the industry again. She chose resignation. Ethan never came back. The moment he caught wind of the financial scandal, he vanished completely. No calls, no texts, no apologies. Just a clean break, like she had never even existed to him. With her out of the picture, the company needed stability. Someone competent. Someone who understood the business inside and out. Me. The transition was seamless. I stepped into her position, took over operations, and within months, the company was performing better than ever. Without her reckless spending, her questionable decisions, and her need for constant validation, everything ran smoother, faster, smarter. I wasn't just keeping the business afloat, I was expanding it. And Laura? She had nothing. No job, no steady income, no luxurious lifestyle. Whatever money she had secretly stashed was drying up fast, and without access to corporate accounts, she was just another disgraced executive with nowhere to go. Then, one evening, as I was reviewing quarterly reports in my new office, my phone buzzed. A single message from her. "You planned all this, didn't you?" I stared at the screen for a moment, then locked my phone and set it aside. Some questions don't need answers. For days, there was nothing. No messages. No desperate attempts to bargain. No outbursts of rage. Laura had disappeared. At first, I assumed she had skipped town. Maybe she had found some other poor bastard to latch onto. Or maybe she was just trying to lay low, hoping to rebuild whatever was left of her broken life. Either way, it didn't matter. As far as I was concerned, this was over. But then, late one night, I woke up to a noise. A sharp, scraping sound. Faint, but unmistakable. I sat up, my senses instantly alert. The house was dark, but something felt off. Reaching for my phone, I opened the security app and tapped into the front camera feed. And there she was. Laura stood just outside my house, bathed in the pale glow of the porch light. She wasn't knocking. She wasn't yelling. She was just standing there staring at the door, gripping a knife in one hand. For a moment, I just watched, my pulse steady but my body tensed. Then, my eyes drifted lower, taking in the dark stains smeared across her clothes, the blood drying on her hands. Not her blood. I knew the signs. The torn fabric at her sleeves, the faint marks on her wrists, signs of a struggle someone had fought back. And looking at her now, at the raw, seething rage in her eyes, I knew one thing for certain. Laura had snapped. I moved carefully, slipping out of bed, retrieving the handgun from my nightstand. I had never needed it before, never thought I'd have to use it. But then again, I had never thought my ex-wife would show up at my house in the middle of the night, covered in someone else's blood, holding a knife like she had nothing left to lose. Taking a slow breath, I unlocked the front door and stepped outside. The air was thick with tension. I could hear my own heartbeat, steady and controlled, as I lifted the gun just enough for her to see it. She didn't flinch. She just smiled, a slow, twisted smile that sent a chill down my spine. "You ruined my life," she whispered, her voice almost soft. Her fingers tightened around the knife. "But I'm not going alone." I kept my stance firm, my grip steady. She had already lost everything. And now? Now she was dangerous. The night was silent, except for the low hum of distant traffic and the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. Laura stood in front of me, her breath shallow, her eyes burning with something beyond anger madness. She clutched the knife tightly, her knuckles white, dried blood staining the blade. I kept my gun trained on her, steady, unshaking, watching her every move. Then, something caught my attention. The parking lot across the street. Laura's car. I didn't know why, but something about it felt wrong. The way it was parked at an angle, the slight fog on the inside of the windows, like it had been sitting there for hours with something or someone inside. Without looking away from her, I took a slow step back. "Where's Ethan?" I asked, my voice calm. Her expression didn't change. Her grip on the knife tightened. I took another step back. My security cameras were still rolling. Every second of this was being recorded. And then, I saw it. The trunk was slightly open. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach, but I forced myself to stay composed. Keeping the gun trained on her, I took a slow step toward the car. Laura didn't stop me. She just stood there, her lips curling into something that might have once been a smile, but now looked like a mask stretched too thin. I reached out, gripped the edge of the trunk, and lifted it open. And there he was. Ethan, or what was left of him. His body was cut to pieces, blood pooled at the bottom of the trunk. His throat had been slit open so deeply that his head lolled unnaturally to the side, eyes frozen in a final, lifeless stare. His stomach had been gutted, the insides exposed, intestines twisted like something pulled apart in a fit of rage. And in his hand, clutched so tightly even in death that his fingers had to be pried open, was a strip of fabric, a piece of Laura's dress. I turned back to her. She was watching me, her eyes wild, her lips slightly parted like she was savoring the moment. "You made me do this," she whispered. I didn't say a word. She took a step closer, the knife still glinting in her bloodied hand. "I loved him," she said, voice raw, "but he betrayed me. Just like you." I barely saw the movement before she lunged, the blade flashing toward my throat, but I was faster. Before she could reach me, I moved a single, swift motion, and suddenly, the knife was out of her hand, clattering onto the pavement. My gun was still in my grip, my finger hovering over the trigger. She froze, breathing hard, staring up at me like she was waiting for me to end it. But I didn't pull the trigger, because I didn't have to. The security cameras had captured everything. The body, the confession. And now, the only thing left was for the police to arrive and take her away. For a split second, everything was still. Laura stood frozen in front of me, breathing heavily, her hands trembling with rage and exhaustion. My gun was steady, but I didn't pull the trigger. There was no need. The cameras had captured it all. Ethan's body in the trunk, her confession, the knife in her hands, her madness on full display. But then, it happened. She took a frantic step forward, but her foot landed in something slick. The blood. Ethan's blood. Her balance wavered. Her eyes widened in sudden terror. And before I could even react, she slipped. It happened in an instant. A sharp thud echoed through the night as the back of her head slammed against the edge of the curb. A sickening crunch followed. A sound I knew immediately meant she wasn't getting back up. I stood there, gun still in hand, watching as her body twitched once, then went completely still. Blood pooled beneath her skull, spreading across the pavement, mingling with Ethan's. Her eyes stared blankly at the night sky. She was dead. Just like that. The silence that followed was deafening. I lowered my gun, exhaling slowly, my mind catching up to what had just happened. In less than a minute, everything had changed. Laura was gone. Ethan was gone. And I was now standing over two dead bodies in the middle of the night, alone, with security cameras rolling. I was in deep, deep trouble. But I wasn't a fool. I had spent years controlling situations, managing crises, staying ahead of the game. I had money. I had connections. And now, I needed a plan. Slowly, I turned off the security cameras and pocketed my phone. Then, I took a deep breath, my mind already calculating my next move. Laura had spent her whole life thinking she was in control. But now, she was just another mistake that needed to be cleaned up. I didn't waste time. With the security cameras disabled and my phone wiped clean of any traces, I made the call. "Michael." He picked up on the second ring. "Jesus, it's late," he muttered, his voice groggy with sleep. "What's?" "I need you," I interrupted, my tone flat, controlled. "Now." There was a pause. Then, his voice sharpened. "Where are you?" "Home," I said. "It's bad." Michael never asked pointless questions. He just understood. Within 20 minutes, he was pulling into my driveway, dressed in dark clothes, a baseball cap low over his face. When he stepped out of the car and saw the two bodies on the pavement, his lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't look surprised. "Fu*K," he muttered, rubbing a hand down his face. "What happened?" She snapped. I said simply, "Killed Ethan. Came for me. Slipped." I gestured to Laura's twisted, lifeless body. "Didn't make it." Michael exhaled sharply, nodding once. "All right," he said. "Let's fix this." We worked in silence, moving fast. The bodies were heavy, but adrenaline and necessity made the job easier. We wrapped them in thick plastic, loaded them into the trunk of Laura's own car, and wiped down the scene meticulously. Blood, fingerprints, any trace that she or Ethan had ever been here gone. Then, we drove. The old warehouse on the outskirts of town had been abandoned for years. It was the kind of place where no one asked questions, where people barely remembered it even existed. Perfect. We dragged the bodies inside, stacked them among rotting wooden crates, and doused the place in gasoline. The stench filled the air, thick and suffocating. Michael struck the match. The fire spread fast, devouring everything in its path, crackling hungrily as it climbed the walls. Within minutes, the warehouse was a raging inferno, smoke billowing high into the night sky. No bodies, no evidence, no crime scene. As the flames roared, I pulled out my phone and sent a single command to my security system. Cameras offline. By morning, Laura and Ethan would officially be missing persons. And me? I would be exactly where I had always been, in control. The office was quiet in the early hours of the morning, the city skyline glowing with the soft hues of dawn. I sat behind my massive new desk, the weight of the last few weeks finally settling into something tangible triumph. The whiskey in my glass was smooth, aged to perfection, the kind that burned just enough to remind you that you were alive. Everything had fallen into place. Laura and Ethan were gone erased. The company was mine, growing stronger every day under my leadership. The scandal had never even touched me. No investigations, no whispers, no suspicions. Just a clean break from a disastrous past and a limitless future ahead. I glanced at the sleek, designer sofa against the far wall. It was one of the new additions to my office, replacing the dull, outdated furniture Laura had once chosen. Everything in this room was mine now, a reflection of my choices, my control, my power. A soft knock sounded at the door. I didn't bother answering. She let herself in. Sophie, my secretary. Young, smart, ambitious. She was exactly the kind of woman who recognized power when she saw it, the kind who knew how to get close to it, and more importantly, how to keep her mouth shut. She walked in slowly, deliberate in her movements, her black pencil skirt hugging every curve. Her blouse was buttoned just enough to be professional, but not enough to hide what she wanted me to notice. She stopped in front of my desk, trailing her fingers along the smooth mahogany surface before tilting her head slightly, her lips curling into a playful smirk. I think we need to discuss some financial matters, she whispered, her voice just low enough to be suggestive. Then, before I could respond, she slid effortlessly onto my lap, her legs straddling me, her hands pressing against my chest. Her perfume was intoxicating, something dark and expensive, the kind of scent that lingered long after someone left a room. I smirked, one hand sliding up her thigh, the other still holding my whiskey. Outside the window, the sun was rising over the city, illuminating a world that belonged entirely to me. The envelope was plain, unmarked, with no return address. It had been slipped under the door of my office in the early morning before anyone else had arrived. At first, I thought it was just another business document, some routine paperwork that had been delivered the old-fashioned way. But when I opened it, my breath caught in my throat. Inside was a single letter, the paper slightly creased, the ink smudged in places. And as I read the first few words, my pulse began to pound. If something happens to me, know that it's not an accident. Adam has planned everything. He is not who he seems. Dated the day before Laura died. For the first time in a long time, a chill crept down my spine. I forced myself to stay calm, to think rationally. This could be a bluff, a desperate attempt from beyond the grave to shake me. But then, I saw what else was inside the envelope. A flash drive. I hesitated for a moment, then walked over to my laptop, plugged it in, and opened the single video file it contained. The screen flickered to life. My garage. I froze. The one camera I had forgotten about. The one that had been mounted high in the corner, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. The only camera I hadn't disabled. And there, in crystal-clear footage, was me and Michael loading the bodies into the trunk of Laura's car. Undeniable. I exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of my desk. My mind was already calculating. Who had this footage? Why hadn't they gone to the police? What did they want? Then my phone buzzed. A blocked number. I stared at the screen for half a second before answering. A voice smooth, controlled, completely unfamiliar spoke on the other end. Great video, right? My jaw clenched. Shall we talk about the price of silence? A slow bead of sweat formed on my forehead. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't the one in control. The world belonged to those who could control it, shape it, and bend it to their will. Adam had always known that. This was no different. The moment he received that phone call, he knew it was coming. A challenge. A game. Another opponent who thought they were smart enough to beat him. He took a deep breath, exhaled slowly, and set to work. The first move was eliminating the video. Whoever had sent it had made the critical mistake of storing it digitally. A few keystrokes, a carefully deployed virus, and every trace of it vanished. If they had any backups online, those were gone too. The next step, tracking the blackmailer. Michael, ever the loyal friend, ran the call's metadata. The signal bounced through layers of proxies, but nothing was perfect. Eventually, it led to an apartment in the city center. That was when the real revelation came. It wasn't the police. It wasn't some outsider. It was Sophia, Laura's sister. Of course, it had to be her. She had always hated Adam, always whispered that Laura could do better, always looked at him like she knew he was playing a bigger game than he let on. Too bad for her. She had no idea what game she had just entered. That night, Adam knocked on Sophia's door. She looked surprised, then terrified. Her hand twitched toward her phone, but he took a smooth step forward, his voice low, controlled. You have two choices. She froze. One, you disappear and pretend none of this ever happened. Two, you end up just like Laura. The blood drained from her face. Adam reached into his coat and placed a thick envelope of cash on the table between them. I suggest you take the money and go far, far away. Sophia hesitated. For a moment, he thought she might be foolish enough to resist, but she wasn't Laura. She wasn't Ethan. She knew when to fold. Slowly, she nodded. One loose end tied up. But Adam wasn't finished. The next morning, he visited the apartment where the blackmail call had originated. A small, dingy space, nothing special. Inside, he found a burner phone, a laptop, and something unexpected. A second security feed. The real blackmailer had left behind more than he realized. The footage showed Ethan before Laura had killed him. He had been playing his own game, recording everything. It was a dead man's switch. If something happened to him, the files would send automatically to Sophia. Adam smirked. Ethan had thought he was clever, thought he had planned for every outcome. But he made one mistake. He underestimated Adam. A few more keystrokes, and every last trace of Ethan's blackmail material was erased. The burner phone? Smashed into pieces and tossed into a trash compactor on his way out. By the time Adam left that apartment, he was the only one left standing. Months later, he sat in his penthouse office, a glass of whiskey in his hand. The company merger had been finalized. His bank accounts overflowed. Every single piece of this game had fallen exactly where he wanted it. Across the room, the designer couch sat in the corner, a $112,000 trophy of his greatest victory. Michael, leaning against the desk, lifted his glass. So was it worth it? Adam smirked, swirling the whiskey in his hand, eyes drifting over the city that was now his to command. Absolutely,